All right, so he's coming off the road, and as you might well imagine, he's now incredibly popular. And when he gets back to town, it says that the whole town turns out. Where I love how they says he was at home. Well, he's staying with Peter and Andrew and James and John in that neighborhood. We think we know where that's at in the city of Capernaum. The Roman Catholics would tell you that they know for sure because they built the church over it. And it's the only ugly church I've ever seen in Israel. I'm not joking one tiny bit. It looks like a spaceship landed on the top of Peter's house. It's a monstrosity. It's actually embarrassing. But it's glass on the sides, kind of on the top, and then it's got a glass floor. So you can walk over the top of what they think is Peter's house. But it looks like the aliens have landed. I mean, and then you compare that to Berluzzi, an Italian architect who was, he's long dead, but he was a great theologian and besides being an architect, and just did unbelievable work. Everywhere he built the church, completely appropriate to the scripture that we have that goes with that location. And I mean, anyway, far be it that I would be overly critical of whoever designed the spaceship, but they should be fired. All right. So what's happening? Again, you got to imagine what the house looks like, and what the street looks like. Think about the hallways here at the church. When we get done with class, go take a look. That's about the width of what a street would have been in Capernaum. It's just wide enough that you could get a cart down the street. So you had some ability to pull, have a donkey or something, some animal that could pull a cart, or a human being, and that you could bring material in, and then you could take some material out. Because I actually don't know what the sewage system was like in Capernaum, but that'd be an interesting conversation. Far be it that I would get diverted here. I could start thinking about that, and anyway, we can't have that. So he's preaching from the house. He's gotten locked in. He can't get out, but he's attempting to preach to this community from the house, and I suspect it's not working very well. Excuse me. So some people are bringing a paralyzed man, and they want him to, their buddy to be healed, and they can't get in, which is not surprising. So what they can do is they can get on top of the roof, because I'm sure almost every roof of every house in Capernaum would have been flat. And they were in fact strong enough that most of the time you could frame them in and build another room up there, which is what dads normally did when their sons got married. So you would, instead of building a whole nother house, you would just simply add a room to the roof and invite your son and your daughter-in-law to move in. So that would have been the normal. And then there would normally be an outside stairwell of some kind that you could get up on there from outside the house, but not always. So in any case, they carry their buddy up there, they lay him down, and they commence to digging the roof up, which, if you just think about that for a little bit, the way you normally would have constructed a flat roof is you would have beams that would have been laid from one wall to the other. They would be covered with something, normally branches or more slats, and then you would have a layer of mud that would obviously get baked. So there would be some way that you could tear this apart and lower your buddy down through But I always think about Jesus trying to have a sermon. And I mean, I've had all kinds of things happen, when I was preaching. But I've never had the roof ripped off. I mean, I just... And I love the fact that Mark is the only one that tells the story. So I don't know if it was just carried from Peter to Mark, but I don't think it's in the other Gospels, if I remember correctly. All right. So when Jesus, so that's the setup. But what goes from there? Son, your sins are forgiven. Now the scribes who were sitting there questioned in their heart, why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And at once Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to them, why do you raise such questions in your heart? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, stand up and take your mat and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he says to the paralytic, I say to you, stand up and take your mat and go to your home. And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them. And they were all amazed and glorified God. We have never seen anything like this. Now, this is, in fact, the setup. This is not the opening shot, but this is the real theological shot that will produce finally and ultimately his crucifixion. He is going right at the teaching and the thinking of the day. So if God's the only one that can forgive sins, it's a pretty bold move for this young rabbi to say that he, in fact, can forgive sins, and proves it by providing a healing. And again, the way it works, you have to remember that being a paralytic would be a sign that, of course, that you were sinful and in need of forgiveness, without a doubt, but that you needed both, so to speak, and Jesus is, in fact, providing both. So, questions. You look like you have a question on your face.
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Working on it. I'll raise my hand up.
All right. I'm going to go see if I can find some water. My voice is ill-prepared. All right. So now we're going to go back to disciple picking here. Unless you've got questions about the paralytic. And about who?
I was wondering about the delineation between forgiving sins and healing. And he's making that clear.
Yep.
This is, it's the same thing, but we're going to do it this way.
Right.
Right now.
Correct.
Because he doesn't at the end mention the forgiving. He just says rise.
Right. So he's already forgiven his sins. That's the first thing that happens in this dialogue. And that's the stage setting. So then the scribes start muttering amongst themselves, and he overhears it, or he knows it, right? And because it would have produced consternation. Mm-hmm. You just don't do that. That's God's job. So then he gets into a dialogue with them, and so that you might believe that I actually have the authority to forgive sins, I'm going to heal him for you. And in many ways, it's part and parcel of the same coin. Because to be forgiven and to be healed restored you to wholeness. So that when Jesus heals people, depending on whatever issues they were having, they get restored to family and community. And it's a sign then that they are in fact forgiven. Because if whatever you have is the result of your sin, your unrighteousness, then the removal of that is a sign then of your acceptance and so all that. So how do I say this? So part of the reason that Christianity happened and that we still have Jews today is that what I've talked about in more than a couple of sermons and also in some Bible studies, that when they're in exile in Babylon in the 500 BC era, there's almost everything that's oral gets put onto paper. So they have to write down the Testament, right? Because they're really deeply concerned that that all the storytellers might be murdered by the Babylonians, and then where would we be? So if the guy that knows Deuteronomy gets killed, we're in big trouble, right? No, I'm picking on that guy, but there would have been more than one guy. But let's just say that we're down to one guy. And if he gets wiped out, we got nothing. So there's a huge movement onto paper. But the other thing that starts to happen in captivity is the whole Rabbinic Movement, where worship, it doesn't happen obviously in Babylon, gets moved from the temple to the kitchen table. So the reason the Jews survived and the reason that Christians could take root is worship didn't need to happen in a synagogue. It didn't need to happen in the temple. It didn't need to happen in a church. It could happen at mom and dad's table. So that when exile happens now, during this time frame, when the Jews and the Christians are being kicked out of Israel and scattered out into the world, they've already established a way of being a faith community around a kitchen table. I mean, if you ever get the chance to go to a Jewish home for Shabbat meal, for the Sabbath meal, it's very ritualized. It'll feel some ways like Holy Communion. A lot of things happen, but it happens at the kitchen table. There will always be normally silver candlesticks. They'll be fancy, even if it's a very poor family. And they'll be placed in front of the oldest woman in the family. And then when you get to the beginning of the meal, she will stand up and do the table prayer and light the 2 candles. So my first trip to Israel, people will regularly invite you over to their table. So we're all a bunch of American pastors, and I'm the visitor. I'm not the tour leader. I'm the punk kid is actually what I am. And we're in a restaurant at the hotel. And what happens with the Jewish families is they get too big for anybody's house, and they can't hold them all. So then they have their favorite restaurant where they have their Shabbat meal. So they haul in their candlesticks. And so here's, truthfully, 5 generations. So this woman is somewhere into her 90s, clearly. And she's got a tattoo with numbers on her arm. And then here are babies, in arms. And so one of the teenage girls comes over, and there's like 4 of us at our table. And they said, well, anybody that wants to join us, you can. And I'm like, I can't get over there fast enough. So we sit at the table with them. And then here comes this ancient woman and her 2 daughters, clearly both in their 70s, have to help her get up. I mean, she's getting up out of a wheelchair, and then they have to hang on to her. Because, if they didn't, she's going down. But by golly, she can get the candles lit, and she certainly knows the prayer and off we go into this worship service / meal. And they were incredibly accommodating. They always put the teenagers that knew how to speak English, and it's a lively conversation, multiple courses of food and beverage, and then finally there's some additional prayers at the end, and then once again, grandma, great-great-grandma gets up and extinguishes the candles. And you're like, holy buckets. So if you ever watch the movie Schindler's List, that's the framing, right? So what do you see in the very opening frame of Schindler's List? A match, right? A big farmer's match being struck. And a woman's hand reaching out and lighting the candles. So Jesus wisely now, in 13, moves out from the house. He gets a little maneuvering room. And he's beside the Sea of Galilee. We think we actually know where this happens. Very northwest corner. It's a nice little amphitheater. The whole crowd gathered around him and he taught them. And as he's walking along, he sees Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, he said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." So, Levi is, we don't get a vivid, deep description of his tax collecting job. He could have been just simply working for the county, so to speak, collecting a trespass fee or a toll fee from the caravans. So when you got to Capernaum and either turned left to head south, west, or turned right and head up to Damascus, they were going to charge you something for going through their territory. So that would be one level of being a tax collector. The other would be that he's working for Herod, which would put him in the category of, how do I say this nicely? Being hated, right? I mean, overtly hated. Because the only way those guys got paid was by overcharging you. They didn't get paid. The normal piece was you had to pay the tax on the front end. You paid it to Herod, and some went to the Romans, because the king actually worked right alongside with the Romans. So you paid the tax up front, or they would loan you the money at interest, but then you had to obviously deliver. So the only way you got paid is if I went to Bob and I went, "This is how much you owe, buddy." And he's like, "Well, that's way more than last year." And I don't care, that's what you got to pay. And I got 2 Roman soldiers here, rented, and they're going to make sure you pay. And you're like, butcher. So I always think about, because we're going to get to one of the other guys in a little bit, who is a zealot. I mean, he's actively working to get rid of the Romans. So you got somebody in the group who works for the Romans, or perhaps works for the Romans, and who cheats his own people. And then you got a guy that's trying to kill him, to get him out of the country. So I always thought, as I'm learning all this, that for at least 2 years there had to be a room monitor, right? So that when Jesus is out of the room, you got problems. That you got to keep these 2 guys from sitting at the same part of the table, because I'm thinking it's not going to go well. So again, the scribes in one sense are correct. There's any number of passages in the Old Testament, or in their case, the Testament, that tell you not to hang out with sinners. And that if you're a good Jewish person, you should not be doing that. So it's not like they're just making it up. They're arguing from Scripture that this is a bad idea. One should not be doing what you're doing, particularly when you're a rabbi. So, right. Questions about that? You know, it's okay to talk in class. I won't like yell at you. Okay.
All these uses of the word sin.
Correct.
What do you think? What's the exact meaning of that? Sinner.
Okay. The word sin it comes from the archery field, comes from bow and arrows. It means to shoot an arrow at the target and either to miss altogether or to not hit the bullseye. So that the idea is, I intended that, and this is what happened. So, sinning is, you've just gotten it wrong, right? I mean, it turned out in a horrible way.
We know that they had 600 plus rules.
Correct.
So it's hard to not be a sinner, I'm thinking.
Yep.
That kind of structure, even to know the rules,
Right.
would take quite a while.
Right. Right.
The classic definition of just separation from God. I guess that's what I'm trying to. You think he was talking about that? Separation. Sin is separation from God. In whatever form.
Well, yeah, that, or it's wanting to be God. That would be the first arrow. I mean, what's the sin of Adam and Eve? They want to be as smart as, the reason they eat of the tree is they want to be as smart as God. They want to know everything. So we don't want God to be involved anymore. We want to be in charge of our entire life.
Yeah.
And by eating this fruit, we get everything we want.
Also, disobedience is sort of up there too, I think, on those two.
Well, that would be the first disobedience, right? This,
yeah.
I'm not.
Separation.
Correct. Correct.
Say, no longer are we going to listen to you.
So
I'm wondering if that's, but this word is their lot. Sinner.
Correct.
And if he was just talking about one of the 600 rules, or where that comes in, I guess we don't know.
So you have the 10 Commandments, which are like the Bill of Rights, right? They're the big barking dogs. And then you have the 660 or whatever it is explanations. They're the things that trickle on down. And then they actually have a book that they work on constantly of how do you live all that out. So there's like a whole book on the Sabbath. I mean, I've talked about it a little bit. So that, how far can you walk before you break the Sabbath? Literally, how many steps can you take before I start, quote unquote, working? So I'm sure any number of husbands used it to not have to go visit my mother-in-law because she's too far away. But then the women figured out, and got a rule, right? They got one of the little rules that if you put a bundle of your clothes at the end of the last step in someone's doorway, now you've established another home where now I get that many steps again. So then you had the wife saying to the husband, well, yeah, we are going to go visit Mom this weekend, because we can make that work. But like if you worked with metal and you picked up a hammer, literally just picked up a hammer, then that was breaking the Sabbath. For the women trying to organize a household, you couldn't start the fire. If your fire went out over the night, you couldn't start a new fire. That was working. Now you could put wood into the fire that was already going. That you could do. So then you were okay. But you weren't, the whole notion of yeast and all that kind of stuff, and that was more around Passover, but there were all these subcategory rules for preparation of food and so on and so forth. So,
how then did they decide to have kosher kitchens? Do they still do that?
oh, absolutely.
They do.
Absolutely. So when we bought our oven, we just remodeled our house a year ago. One of the things that we got was we got a kosher oven. Now I haven't activated it, which means I could set it up on Friday before sunset, that it will come on by itself at noon on Saturday, and it will turn on to 400 degrees or whatever I want it to be. And then at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it'll go off. So it's okay for me to open the door of the oven, but it would be breaking the Sabbath to turn the oven on.
But it's not breaking the Sabbath by putting something in the oven.
Correct. That's okay. It's the turning the oven on. Yes.
As a kid, I remember arguing with my mother, did I really have to feed the chickens and gather eggs on Sunday because we were not supposed to
Correct.
work on Sunday? Would that be considered breaking the Sabbath?
No, there are all kinds of rules of what you can do with livestock. I mean, what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. So it was okay, like if you had, hardly anybody would have had a cow, but if you were milking goats, I mean, it was okay for you to go milk a goat, because if you don't milk the goat, what? I mean, she can get mastitis and so on and so forth. So there, you can tend to livestock on the Sabbath, but you're not supposed to be working them, right?
Well, I didn't get by with it.
No, the rabbi would have said, young lady, you need to go. Yeah, the Jewish rabbi wouldn't help you out on this one. So,
My mother didn't either.
are you guys hearing me?
Yeah,
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
That's why Jesus mentioned that time about the donkey falling
Yeah.
in the hole. You
Right.
can get him out,
You can get him out.
but the human falls in the hole.
No, you can get the human out too. If a human got hurt or was injured or fell in a hole or whatever, you can tend to them. That's okay on the Sabbath. But that's not whom Jesus ever heals on the Sabbath. It's always a chronic illness, a chronic, injury, something that happened years ago, so on and so forth. I mean, he's very clear that he's doing something on purpose to make a point. Because that's their anger then, is what, you couldn't wait for 4 hours? Right? Because the new day starts, Sunday starts when the sun goes down on Saturday. So really? I mean, this person's been sick for 16 years and you can't, let me think, you can't wait for 4 hours. No. Yep. So is that helpful? So where I used to be pastor in Mitchell, Mitchell's mostly a German town, not completely a German town, but it's right next door to the big German wave that kind of washed up on his doorstep. So you have Armor, Corsica, and then you start having Dutch people once you get to Corsica. What are you doing? Don't be going away. And I would regularly get farmers in my office for a second opinion, because the reformers, the Germans, who are almost all Lutheran, some Catholics, but mostly Lutheran, if the blizzard was coming on Monday and they had corn in the field, they were going to combine, right? Nobody was going to let corn stand out there just so they didn't work on Sunday. Now, they didn't work cattle, even if there was going to be a blizzard, but their Reformed neighbors would drive out in the field and stop them and yell at them for working on the Sabbath. So they'd go to their pastor and they'd listen to the pastor from the Dutch Reformed, and then they'd want a third opinion. So more than once I'd have a farmer in, and so I'd grown up with a Norwegian grandfather who did work on Sunday if weather was coming, and I had a German grandfather that did exactly the same thing. Now there had to be a reason. It wasn't just because otherwise it was just milking cows and getting the eggs. Yeah, sorry. The Zelmer and the Johnson family aren't going to help you out here on this one. So, yeah. So part of it is, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? And that's part of what Jesus' argument is going to be, as we're going to find out here shortly. What is the Sabbath for? Is it to be righteous, or is it given as a gift? That would be. Okay? All right. Excuse me. I think I talked too much this last weekend. So John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot fast while the bridegroom is there, can they? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day." So, do we have anybody old enough who ever got to go to a real serious German wedding out on the prairies, particularly in Iowa? I got to one when I was a boy. Oh, baby, was that something. It was 3 days of food. I have never eaten so much in my entire life. It was unbelievable. And I don't know why it lasted 3 days. I was probably 6 or 7 years old. But I know that I was there with Mom and Dad, and it was some cousin of Dad's. And it lasted for 3 days. And the wedding was on the first night. And holy mackerel, it was incredible. Never got invited back. I don't know if I ate too much or if they stopped doing that. But that's the argument he's making. So, and most weddings in Israel in the first century, that's the whole story about the wedding in Canaan. They lasted for sure a day and a night, and normally it was a whole weekend that they would last. Weddings were great big deals. And the reason that you ran out of wine is your friends that you invite are supposed to help supply wine. Oh yeah. I didn't learn that until 2 trips ago. So part of the embarrassment of this whole situation is it's an indication you don't have enough friends, or that your friends really don't like you. So, I like that. Okay. Now we're going to find out about making wine, because Jesus says nobody sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old cloak. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it, and the new from the old, and the worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into an old wineskin. Otherwise, it will burst, and the wine is lost, and so are the skins. But one puts new wine in new wineskins. Anybody ever made wine here? Really? You've never made wine? You got to give it a whirl. It's more fun. It's like being a mad scientist at home. It's great. Because if stuff goes bad, it breaks and wine shoots all around. It's lovely. My grandmother loved to make wine. It was horrible wine, but she liked making it. And she had a particularly bad batch one year. And these gallon jars of, oh, Lord Almighty, 3 of them blew up. And it was like you had machine gunned that part of the basement. And you could really never get the smell out. I mean, after that, it was. And all my grandpa did was he looked in there and went, oh, just turned around and walked away. Oh, it was lovely. Things you remember from being a child, right? So, yeah, so for future, if you go to making wine, you cannot reuse your wineskins. So, all right. How are we doing on time? Good. So do you understand his argument, though? I mean, he's making an argument really about himself. So I'm the new thing, which means, and I am so different from what has come before. I'm just doing it in a different way. And part of it is we're going to have a conversation about the Sabbath. All right. Which is where he ends up. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Who's ever watched the movie True Grit? Right? This is when the bad guys say, "Bold talk for a one-eyed fat man." Clearly you've never watched that movie.
Which one?
The first one. Well, it's in both movies. But John Wayne, it's a better movie. Just saying. Anyway. So he's making a statement, and the title that he's giving himself, Son of Man, is just another title of human beings. Human beings were not made for the Sabbath. It was given as a gift. The reason that you and I don't work 7 days a week are because of the Jews. They demanded a day off. Now, part of our concern culturally in America is we're not very good at not working. We work way more than the rest of the world. And part of that's really good. But the vast majority, over half the people, do not use their full days off. And over half our workers don't take all their vacation. Right? I buried a pastor on internship who was quite proud of the fact he'd never taken vacation in 40 plus years of being a pastor. He was also quite proud of the fact that he'd never heard his sons sing, and all 5 of his boys sang like angels. And they had planned this the church had raised all this money for them, and they were going to send him on a world tour. They were going to travel the world for a year. When do you suppose he died? Oh yeah, a week before his retirement. And wow, I mean, it was unbelievable. So I don't know that he was keeping the Sabbath, right? There's part of life that needs to be lived in a way that provides some relaxation and time with family and so on and so forth. So, what do you think, Bob?
Well, I think, remember Pastor Greg Wilcox, was saying one time that you would go mow his grass on the Sabbath on Sunday.
Yeah.
Just because it was something different, and it's relaxing to do that.
Yep. One of the people that was very influential in my career was Pastor Bill Pepke. And he was a Missouri Synod pastor that worked over at Mansfield for most of my time, well, all my time when I was at Scandinavia in Bethany. Great German, had a wonderful wife, still has a wonderful wife, and wonderful kids. And they really kind of took us under their wing and he raised cattle. And not as a sideline. I mean, he just liked cows. And I said, well, why do you do that? And he goes, well, because they're always happy to see me. They're never angry, and they never have to have a meeting, and they never complain. I go, okay. So we've always tried to have livestock of some kind in our world. And I love dogs, like to train them. And anyway, because I can go out to get the mail and come right back in. And they're just so doggone happy to see me on the second time. And my wife does not treat me that way. I mean, she might when I first come in, but if I go get the mail, there's not this great warm welcome when I return. I mean, it just is a gift to have this creature that you're interacting with. Well, for me, that's kind of a Sabbath moment. I mean, here's a relationship, and it's life-giving, I think, to the dog, and certainly is life-giving to me. And so how do you use the Sabbath in ways that are appropriate? So, because you can certainly work through them and be inappropriate in them. Yeah, we'll keep going. But then somebody has to remember that we got into chapter 3, because it's going to be a week or so before we get together again. So when Jesus entered the synagogue, a man was there who had a withered hand, and they watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had a withered hand, come forward. And Jesus said to them, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save the life or to kill? But they were silent. He looked at them with anger and was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and the hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So now we have arrived at the first overt threat of death. So they have angered people now enough that we're gonna think about destroying him. And this would, how do I say this? What's a good comparison? Let's just say the Pharisees and the Herodians didn't normally hang out. None of you people are cattle people, are you? No. So in the world I used to live in, the Stock Growers Association and the beef producers they don't like each other. And I'm not kidding now, you just don't put them in the same room, because there's half a chance that you could end up with a pushing match, and certainly you'll end up with a fight. In fact, the only time I've ever seen them work together was after the big blizzard in 2011. In fact, I about had a small stroke when I walked in, and here were people that I knew from both organizations sitting next to each other and actually having a conversation that did not involve shouting. But the Pharisees, well, it's not a political thing. Well, it is kind of. They would have been nationalists. They would want the Romans to leave, correct? The Herodians are people that are supporting Herod, King Herod, which means they are supporting the Romans. They don't want the Romans to leave, because if they do, their power base will dissipate and go away. So you've got religious people that are on opposite ends of the spectrum politically and nationally that now are actually working together, trying to get rid of Jesus. All right. So Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him. Hearing all that he was doing, they came to him in great number from Judea, Jerusalem, Idum, and Idumean, beyond the Jordan, and the region around Tyre and Sidon. He told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowds, so they would not crush him. For he had cured many, so that all who had diseases pressed upon him to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits saw them, they fell down before him and shouted, "You are the Son of God." but he sternly ordered them not to make him known. All right, let's see if I can find a good map. My one complaint about this map is, well, this will work. All right. So they're here. Okay, that's where all this is going on. And Capernaum would be, you see where the little bar on the F is on the lake? It'd be just to the right of that. And then this whole bulge is relatively flat on the shore. So here, along that green arc, Jesus could literally speak to a pretty good multitude. He would need a boat to get it done, but it was flat enough, and there was just enough rise that people could hear you. Okay? So the places that he's talking about, one's over here. Here's Sidon up here. Here's Tyre. And that's, once you go past north of the Sea of Galilee, you're out of Israel. And that's still true today. Right about there is the border with Lebanon. And then all of this over here on this side, this was the Gentile land over on the east side. And we think the demoniac, remember, is right down here because there is a cliff right about where the eye is on the Sea of Tiberias. So there is a pretty sharp escapement right there. And then today, right about here, yeah, right there in that draw. If you go this direction, you're in Syria. And if you go this direction, you're in Jordan. All right? And to say that there are, well, it does tell you that you don't want to run off the road. If you get a flat tire and run off the road, you're probably going to blow up. Because there's minefields all over this area, both laid by the Israelis and by Syria and by the Jordanians. So, and it is astonishing. This is almost always brown because the Syrians, I think they routinely kill the vegetation because they want to see people coming. They don't want anybody to hide. The Jordanians do some farming relatively close. And then the Israelis, it's just green. I mean, it's this lush. So then in the 67 war, that's when they took the Golan Heights. So when you farmed, before 67, there's lots of farming out here. The Syrians would sit up there with their big cannons, and they would, not every day, but they would sometimes take target practice at tractors. So they'd shoot from up here on top of the Golan Heights and try to take out a guy planting. Anyway, when you think you know something about it, the Holy Lands, you find out it's more complicated than what you think. So was that helpful? Not helpful? No. Stop talking. All right, that's a good place to stop. We're at 5 till. And hopefully I can remember, because we'll start with the naming of the 12. Okay?
Thank you.
You are most welcome.
Who was Mark?
Who was Mark? We believe that Mark is the son of one of the women that took care of Jesus and the disciples in the Bethphage area. And we think that he was the student of Peter. And that what precipitates the gospel writing is Peter is now an old man and is more than likely captive, that he's been arrested and is awaiting trial and so on and so forth. So I don't know how to turn that off. But she's mentioned in some of Peter's letters. When you read 1st, 2nd, 3rd Peter, there's some references to her, not so much to the boy. And then we think when Jesus is being arrested in the Gospel of Mark, there's it says young man, which would, in the Greek, that means teenager, that ends up being the first streaker. They try to grab hold of him, and he ends up losing his clothes. And it says in the text that he runs away naked. So, yeah, pretty good evidence that's who that is.